neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
On November 25, 1963, a nation came together to mourn the loss of a dynamic American icon, as Kennedy's horse-drawn caisson traveled from the U.S. Capitol to a requiem mass at St. Matthew's Cathedral, before leaders from 92 countries followed his caisson to Arlington National Cemetery, where he was buried with full military honors on a slope below Arlington House. At the request of his widow, Jacqueline lit an eternal flame, which still burns to this day in honor of the fallen president, making the assassination of John F. Kennedy a prescient foreshadowing of a nation's violent years to come.
Let's go back to Love Field, and let's go back for the presidential arrival. So you saw the airplane, which is SAM, 26,000 is the tail number. Special Air Missions is what that stood for, but then it was Air Force One because the president was on board. We all know that Air Force One is only when the president's on board, because we've learned that from some people that have, been here before, right? So you're on the field at Love Field. You're ready for the arrival. We see the president get off, and he's all tanned up. And I think there was a remark on the news about that. You talked about there was no animosity in Dallas, and there's a very famous story that Governor Conley actually tells that when they were riding along the motorcade, they saw one sign that said "Go Home, John," and the president turned to Governor Conley and he said, "Well, he's probably a nice man." Tell us, so when you saw them get off the back of the airplane, they were actually supposed to go right to the car, but it was ended up being a beautiful day, and they went to the crowd.
Well, the president always a vote getter or seeker. As soon as the welcoming committee, the meeting, well, first of all, the president and first lady, as soon as they stepped off the plane, it was just cheers of Jackie, Jackie, Jackie filled the air. It was like nobody wanted to see the president. They all wanted to see the first lady. And they came down, had a very brief welcoming committee meeting, and this was rehearsed. We went through the same thing at every stop. But as soon as that was over with, instead of heading to the limousine, President Kennedy went right into the crowd. It's a Secret Service nightmare. He was shaking hands, greeting Mrs. Kennedy, hesitated a moment, and she ended up following him. Clint Hill and I followed her, and we walked along a fence. So people were reaching over and they were shaking hands. Very eager, happy crowd.
So you were 23 when you came into the Secret Service, right?
24.
24, and then 28 in Dallas?
28 Dallas.
Yeah.
So.
And so you're trying to get them to the car. You're really watching the crowd and everything. The car, against Secret Service's wishes, was an open top. The president asked for an open top. He wanted to be seen by the folks in Dallas. It was a beautiful day. The skies opened up and it was gorgeous. So they had the top off the car, and they made it their ways to the motorcade. And then we saw the motorcade pull off of Love Field. Yeah. And back then you saw a lot of crowd, a lot of people on the tarmac. That doesn't happen today. You will not see crowds like that for a presidential movement or an arrival in any city. They'll be back further enough, and that's why you see the president usually waving, because he's waving to the distant crowds away. So this was a unique and well before any time where we would allow that. So the motorcade moves off. You jump on that Cadillac car that's riding behind the famous Lincoln that the president's riding in.
Yes.
And you're on the passenger side, running board. There's 2 and 2, and you're the second guy in the back, right?
Right rear running board.
It's supposed to be about a 12-minute ride to where the president was giving his speech. Was that?
It was about 11 miles.
Yeah.
So.
And so you're going to snake through Dallas, and let's talk about the snaking through Dallas before we got to Dealey.
Well, the closer we got to Dallas, the crowds had been very sparse on the outskirts. And mainly as we approached the downtown area, there were crowds more around intersections. But as the closer we got, the more people. And as we approached Main Street, the crowds were really thick. And we made the turn onto Main Street, and it was like something I'd never seen or witnessed before. The crowds were solid. Everybody was cheering, yelling. It was a 4-lane like highway through the center of town. We barely had enough room to get through with presidential's limousine. We had motorcycle escorts that were beside the limousine. The crowd was so thick they had to drop back in order to get through. People were hanging out of windows. They were on fire escapes. Somebody was on a theater marquee there. Everything was loud. Lots of cheering.
Everybody trying to get a view of Jackie and the president.
It was a friendly crowd.
Jackie was, we have Andrew, our First Ladies man, right here in the front row. Jackie was, she was a unique First Lady, kind of probably one of the first of her kind. Keen eye for design. We have her to thank, our blue and white color scheme that we see on Air Force One. We have Mrs. Kennedy to thank for that. She thought that the airplane was a little too regal looking when they came into office. The colors were silver, black, and orange. Mrs. Kennedy thought it would be better to change the colors. They changed them to white representing the clouds, blue representing the sky. And if you look at the side of the airplane where it says United States of America, it's the same font as the title of the Declaration of Independence. So we have Mrs. Kennedy. She was a unique First Lady, would you not say, Andrew?
Very much so. Mrs. Kennedy is what I always call a triple threat. She was young, she was attractive, but she was intelligent, naturally intelligent. But on top of that, highly educated. And there are very, very specific instances, even through when he was running, when JFK was running for Senate, that she would go to these live events and he would lean over and ask her to help him complete speeches on the go, and she would fill in famous lines from famous plays and famous speeches of other politicians. And a true asset that, like Paul, you said, when she got off the plane, people were yelling for Jackie, not JFK. Just wildly, wildly popular, and added to the excitement and the fervor, the electricity of an event like this event in Dallas. Yeah.
There's always an amazing woman behind every amazing man, right? I mean, let's face it. The women are the reason, right? You're listening, right, babe? My wife's watching, probably by feet. That's for her. So, okay, Paul, we're approaching Dealey Plaza now, and you're scanning the crowd. So let's talk about that.
Well, we reached the end of Main Street. The crowds were thinning out quite a bit. We made a right turn on Houston, and I continued scanning a few people that were along the sidewalk. And a short distance away, we had a sharp hairpin turn to the left onto Elm Street, and the limousine had to really slow down almost to a crawl to make it around that turn.
So we're watching all of this unfold in television and the arrival, and there's a 3-year-old, right? Three-year-old Dr. Larry Cook watching the events as well. And tell me, why did that turn into this for you?
Well, I wasn't there in Dallas, but I was at home, and you said earlier a few tears will be shed here, and I can't say this without tearing up. I haven't been able to for 60 years now. But November 22nd, 1963 is my first memory in life. I was 3 years old. I don't remember November 21st, but I remember the shock and the horror on my mother's face. And my father was getting ready for work, and he was in the bathroom, and my mother, I remember that bathroom door opening, and her telling my father that the president had been shot. And I think that's what started my interest in the presidents. I think that's why I'm here today as a historian. And the only thing I remember after that is I remember my mother explaining to me what had happened. I remember her telling me that John was my age. And I can remember thinking, that poor kid doesn't have a father like I do.
Yeah. So Henry, you're in your work truck and you're driving to the downtown area because you're just going to work that day, but you know that the president's going to be in that area. So how soon were you kind of in that area to where the crowds were and the motorcade and everything?
That day, the newspaper had published the route of the motorcade. So my job, I was working for a large wholesale grocer company, and my job each day was to go in to take the company car, go into Dallas and collect the mail and come back. So I said, I'm gonna time it and see if I can see the motorcade because I knew the route. So I left at noon, and then I went down Stemmons Freeway, and there's an inside median right next to the separating the other outgoing traffic. So there were several cars pulled over inside there, so I pulled inside and I had the radio on, and I just waited for the motorcade.
Okay, well, we're going to stop you there because
Okay.
you're pulled over and you're ready for the motorcade.
Yeah.
The motorcade is just turned onto Elm, taking that left, and you're scanning the crowd, and
As soon as we made the turn, there is a famous picture that was
yeah,
taken.
we have it outside, so you'll be able to see it.
Exactly when that first shot rang out. But we had no sooner straightened out, and I had been scanning the crowd, and I looked ahead at the president's vehicle. Everything was okay, and it was just bam. I heard the sound of a high-powered rifle, came from behind me, over my right shoulder. I turned to look. I couldn't. The initial reaction, it's very hard for me to compress 6 seconds into a 6-second talk.
Sure.
But as we have been making the turn, I noticed the grassy area ahead that we were approaching, and there was hardly anybody there compared to what we had seen. But as soon as I heard the first shot, I looked at the president's limo. I saw him leaning to the left. He was raising his arms, and I thought he was turning just to see where the noise came from. I did not realize that he had been hit at that point. I was scanning quickly. I scanned around, looking again to the right, and it was only a couple seconds later, it was bam, a second shot. And I quickly looked at the president's limo. I saw no reaction there out of anybody. And very shortly or quickly after that, there was a third shot. I had been turning around. I just happened to be looking at the limo again. I saw the assassin's bullet find its mark. President's head exploded. The air filled with a pink mist of blood and flesh. And I even ducked to avoid getting splattered as we drove through that. And then we were on our way to Parkland.
So Agent Hill, who's on the left-hand side front running board, reacts and runs to the front of the president's limo, jumps on the back of the limo, and meets Mrs. Kennedy on the trunk, and she's reaching for parts of the president's head. And he didn't realize that, but he got up there, they met each other. He jumps on top of them, spread eagle, and that's what you see. You actually see the motorcade passing with Agent Hill, spread eagle over the top of the president and the first lady.
Yeah, like I said, I was parked inside that medium, and so I had the radio on, and the radio said there's some unconfirmed reports that some shots were fired into the motorcade, but nobody was hit. So about a minute later, you drive by me in the second car. But anyway, here comes a motorcade, and I see Clint Hill on the back of the trunk. And I said, man, they're going 70, 80 miles an hour. What's that guy doing on the trunk? I didn't know what had happened. And you passed me about 30 feet that way.
To the Simmons Freeway.
Yeah.
Yeah, so now we're racing towards Parkland. Clint says to the driver, get to the hospital, and your car's just buzzing along too. You guys, I mean, did you stay on the running boards or did you just jump in?
Well, I was hanging on about halfway to the hospital. I was hanging on the outside, and Agent Bennett, who had been sitting in the center of the car, grabbed me by the shoulders and arm and pulled me in.
You saw in the video that as the motorcade, after the shots, the motorcade is passing, and people are still waving, and they're along the freeway, because, you know, it's still the motorcade, and they had no idea what had just happened on the other side of the underpass. So that must have been interesting, because here you're trying to get to save the president's life, and all these folks are trying to get a glimpse of what they thought was the president going by.
Right, and they had no idea really what happened at that point, and I did hear at some point afterwards there were complaints why we drove by so quickly. And
so we get to Parkland, and the cars pull in, and you go over to the president's limousine, and of course it's kind of craziness. They're pulling gurneys out. Mrs. Kennedy is just there with the president, holding the president, and wouldn't let him go.
As soon as we arrived at Parkland, yes, I jumped up out of the follow-up car, I raced up to the president's limo. I reached over the left rear door. I took Mrs. Kennedy by the shoulders. I said, "Mrs. Kennedy, please let me help you." And she just said, "No, no, no, I want to stay with him." And she continued leaning over, holding his head in her lap.
Yeah, and then you finally, Agent Hill took off his jacket and covered up the president, because what she was trying to do was she was trying to protect anybody from seeing what she was holding there. So you get him finally get him covered, and you get him onto the gurney.
Yes, well, Clint raced around as soon as I let go of Mrs. Kennedy's shoulders. Clint raced around behind me. He opened the rear door, and I followed him into the limo, and Mrs. Kennedy would not release the president's head. Finally, I think he remembered or figured out what was going on. He took off his silk coat and covered her head. Meantime, I had been scanning. I'd seen the crack in the windshield of the president's limo. As I entered, I'm still scanning, looking around. I see Wynn Lawson, our advance agent, running along, pulling a gurney, coming towards us, and then behind him was somebody else pulling a gurney. And I couldn't figure out right away why we had two gurneys. And then it was then I'd seen Governor Connolly had blood on his shirt. And my first reaction was that it was blood splattered from the president. It was then I kind of realized that he'd been hit also. A lot of confusion, a lot of people. I'm looking around. I don't see any other agents. I don't know where they disappeared to. And as soon as I scanned the back door, and it was a bad scene. It was spattered with blood and flesh, and I looked down beside where Mrs. Kennedy was sitting, and there was a bright red pool of blood. There were 2 bullet fragments in the blood. I reached down, picked up the larger of the 2. It was about the size of the end of my little finger, and it was mushroomed like it had hit something. I immediately put it down where I found it. Now, I'm still not seeing anybody coming, any agents in the area. And Mrs. Kennedy is starting to stand up. They've removed the president's body. There's room to get out the back door. And as soon as she stood up, right on the top of the seat where she had been sitting was a fully intact bullet. It had rifle striations. The bullet was about 2 inches long, I'm guessing, and I knew it had been fired, but at that point, I didn't know anything else other than I started to put the bullet back, and the crowd was starting to merge on the limo, and I'm worried that this is everything's spinning, important piece of evidence. I didn't want it to disappear. I started to put it back. And I said, no, I got to keep this so it doesn't get lost, a souvenir hunter, somebody.
So this is what's so amazing about the Cherry Blossom Festival. For over 60 years, we didn't know any of this. And for over 60 years, Paul has kept all of this up until last year, really to himself, until he started to see so many different stories and so many different reports about different things from people who maybe weren't there. And so we're hearing this for the first time. You're going to read it in his book, The Final Witness, which he will let you know how you can get one. He's unfortunately all sold out, but you can meet him out in the lobby, and we have some photographs from that day that he's happy to sign for you. But we're reading about this and we're hearing about this for the first time in over 60 years. So you take that bullet, you put it in your pocket, what happens next?
Well, by then Clint Hill was escorting Mrs. Kennedy out of the limousine. I knew I had to be stay with Mrs. Kennedy. And as we're going out, I noticed Mrs. Kennedy left her clutch purse on the seat. Her pillbox hat was there. I picked them both up, and then there was also a Zippo lighter with the presidential seal on it. And I thought, well, I'll pick that up too, but I'll slip that into my pocket because I figured Mrs. Kennedy doesn't need to see this. I knew she would sneak a cigarette every once in a while when she wasn't in the public. I thought that was her lighter. And I just figured I would give it to Provy, her maid, when we got back to the White House. Meanwhile, I'm catching up with the gurney. We're flying through the emergency entrance door. Mrs. Kennedy is right behind the gurney. I'm to her left. Clint Hill was on the right. And we race down a hallway, and we come to, I know, trauma room 1. The hallway was kind of narrow. We had to swing the gurney around a 90-degree angle to get through the door. This was utter chaos at that point. People hollering, screaming. We had all these people joining the procession, and they were pushing and shoving, and I thought they were being very rude. I was thinking, what's wrong with all these people? And literally, Mrs. Kennedy stepped behind the gurney. I stepped behind her to keep her from being jostled. And as soon as we get in the trauma room, she steps to the left. She's out of, and I'm immediately pushed up against the examination table. They were already removing the president's body from the gurney onto the table, and everybody was focused on the president's head wound. I could not look. I knew if I was having enough trouble at that point, keeping my emotions and everything together. I knew if I looked at the president's head, I'd pass out. And I was wedged up against the exam table, and the president's body were right by my side. I was right by his feet. And meantime, doctors are hollering, please let me in, I need to get in. Other doctors hollering, please make room, we have to give us room to work. And everybody started to try to get out of the trauma room, just like they were pushing and shoving when they were trying to get in. My mind is kind of spinning. I've got this bullet. It's an important piece of evidence that needs to be with the president's body. So I've been fumbling and had it in my pocket. I took it out, and I reached out and I put it right by the president's left shoe. And as soon as I put it down, it started to roll. And I grabbed it quickly, and I'm thinking, guys, this thing falls on the floor, it's lost. The moment's gone. I won't be able to retrieve it. And I was able to stop it from rolling. There was a little wrinkle in the blanket or sheet that he was on, and it just stayed there. And by then, the room was almost empty. Mrs. Kennedy was standing by the doorway. I went up, stood next to her, and then we stepped out.
So Andrew, you met one of the daughters of one of the doctors at Parkland, and tell me real quick again that.
Yeah, a little different. I'm gonna turn around just so folks can hear it. I just met Paul today, and I said, Paul, I know the daughter of one of your associates, one of your colleagues. And I said, do you know the name Jack Reedy? And his eyes kind of lit up. He said, Jack Reedy, yeah, he was riding the rail. Jack Reedy was a Secret Service agent, so not one of the doctors, but a Secret Service agent that worked with Paul. Jane Reedy, his daughter, was at one of my speeches outside of Washington, D.C., and she said, I'd like to introduce myself to you and tell you about my father. She said, please read his obituary in the Washington Post, and he had died recently, but it was his first assignment, Jack Reedy, to go to Dallas. And what a lot of folks don't know about the trip after Dallas, because there wasn't anything after Dallas, but the LBJ Ranch was getting ready for a barbecue that the Vice President and his wife, Lady Bird, were hosting for President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy. And there's a whole nother story about that I won't even take the time to get into. I'd be happy to talk with you individually about it, but that's a remarkable part of this story as well. But Jack Reedy is not in that famous photo. He's one of famous people, one of two people that I've had the fortune of meeting or having a connection to that are not in the famous photo of LBJ swearing in. And Jack Reedy was not in that photo with everybody because he was guarding the president's body in the hold of Air Force One. And this was his first assignment. And Paul, you said, as soon as I said Jack Reedy, you said he was riding the rail. So he was right there, and it's just one of these names that gets lost and pushed aside in all of the other stories and everything. But to meet these people, like you said, Richard, face to face, and put these puzzle pieces to something that everyone knows where they were when it happened, or even if they weren't alive when it happened, they know where they were when they found out that it happened, or things like that. There's one other woman that I'll mention, not in that famous photo of LBJ being sworn in, is Mary Gallagher, and that's Mrs. Kennedy's secretary, who had come down from Boston. She worked in Senator Kennedy's office, and she was Mrs. Kennedy's lead secretary and assistant. And she's behind Mrs. Kennedy, physically supporting her, holding her up in that photo when LBJ was swearing in. And there's just a lot of these pieces and a lot of these connections that come in.
So Henry, what do we? You go on to work, and you work your day. How does one continue to work when you find out that our president has been assassinated?
One thing I mentioned when the motorcade came by, I was focused on Clinton Hill on the trunk of the car, but I saw a lady in a pink dress, and I assumed that was Jackie Kennedy, because later I read, she was wearing a pink Chanel dress. Mm-hmm. And I met Clinton Hill years later, and I told him that, and he said, no, that wasn't Jackie Kennedy. He had pushed both Kennedys out of sight at the bottom of the back seat. That was Nellie Conley that I saw, because she was also wearing a similar pink dress. And so I got back to work, and we had the radio on. And then about, I think, 3 o'clock or something like that, it said the Air Force One is going to be flying over, going back to D.C. So we all went out in the front lawn of where I was working, and I got a picture of it. We saw Air Force One flying in the vicinity of our company back to D.C.
Jamie, when you hear about the poise that Mrs. Kennedy showed that day, both in really at the hospital and more importantly at the swearing in, was that her as you knew her as a sister?
Yes, and she was more poised than almost any person I had met. My christening was her coming out party, and so I don't, that's not my first memory, it's yours. But the articles about that, kept on sort of saying this is not any ordinary debutante. She, of course, became debutante of the year.
Yeah, there's many, we see the videos of her speaking French during the speeches and kind of showing up the president a little bit. And she really made him look good, as all wives do. Hi, babe. See, there, did that again. See? Okay, so now we have the bullet, and you've set it down. How does that bullet end up somewhere else.
After I put the bullet down, and as we left trauma room 1, I just felt a huge relief that I had done the right thing. I left the bullet. It was going to be found during the autopsy. It was an important piece of evidence. It was going to help them. And besides all the other confusion going on, I just went out, and all I was seeing now in my mind was a video, just like a taped loop of the president's head exploding that kept going over and over and over, and I'm trying to keep myself together. We're out of the hospital. It was kind of a wild weekend from there on. I never knew all the bit about, at that time, about finding the bullet somewhere else or anything about Governor Conley.
Yeah, because the bullet eventually ended up on the gurney where Governor Conley was, right? Is that?
I have read.
Yeah. Again, with
Since
reading,
then,
yeah.
It was, several years that I refused to talk about the assassination. I refused to read anything about it. At one point, I don't remember exactly where I read the story that this bullet came. Well, I do remember.
Yeah.
It was 50 years later at the anniversary when Hosea Thompson, there's a long story how I ended up with his book about the assassination, but I started reading it after the 50th anniversary. And I'm going through and I'm thinking, boy, this guy is pretty accurate. Everything's good, and it's just like I remember. And I got to page 146 on 6 Seconds in Dallas, and they had a picture of my bullet that they were attributing, they found came from Governor Conley's stretcher, or gurney, and it was no way, and that was a shock to me. I knew a little bit about all the zigzag bullet, and I don't know how anybody bought that theory that this one single bullet had done all the damage it had done.
Making history here in Marshfield, folks. So Parkland is chaos on the airplane. The crew has been notified that they are going back to Dallas, that there has been an incident on the airplane. Again, this now is coming from firsthand. A friend of mine, Chief Joe Chappell, who was your flight engineer on Air Force One that afternoon, told me the story that they were getting ready. They were serving the crew a ground feed, what they call a ground feed, where they're giving the crew some lunch while they're waiting on the board, because the crew doesn't leave the airplane. They were just going on to another location after that. And they get a notification something's happened. They come back, and of course, there's no way that they're going to leave Dallas without the president. Mrs. Kennedy didn't want it. The Secret Service didn't want it. Dallas police say, no, this is a homicide, and he's going to stay here. So lots of back and forth. That must have been, as you described it, crazy.
Well, at that point, Mrs. Kennedy was sitting outside Trauma Room 1. I was about 10 feet, let's say like 2 o'clock away from her. And I can see her, I can see confusion going on in the hallway. And it was, well, the other side of the exam room, or the emergency room. And I really didn't know what it was about. I missed a lot of the activity that was going on. I would say I was in shock at that point too, and I was struggling just to keep everything together.
So they get a casket, and they get the president loaded, and now you're going to bring the casket out to put it in the back of the ambulance and talk about that interaction with Mrs. Kennedy. Where she was going to ride, but versus where she wanted to ride.
Right. So.
Yeah. she wanted to ride in the back of the ambulance with.
So, yes, we got there. She rode him back to the ambulance. I was in the car right behind, followed till we got to Air Force One. I was at the bottom of the ramp, standing with her when they were carrying the casket up. I didn't know until later that they had to break the handles off the
Yeah, they had to
casket.
break the handles off, as well as Joe. Chief Chappell actually had to take his Leatherman that he had on his belt, and he told me that he undid the bulkhead, the back bulkhead of the President's stateroom is in the back of the aircraft. Now it's in the front of the airplane, but at that point, on that particular Air Force One, the President's stateroom was in the back of the aircraft. They wanted the casket to go up the back of the aircraft to be placed. They took 4 captain's chairs out of the back stateroom, and that's where it was going to be strapped in. So you're down at the bottom of the stairs with Mrs. Kennedy. You're watching the casket get loaded. It has to make that turn, and as it makes that turn to get through the bulkhead, that's where they break the handle, have to break the handles off so it can do that.
Right, and I didn't find that out till later when I was helping them take the casket off, and I picked up the casket and the handle broke off in my hand, and it must have been a handle that they had not completely removed. But my first thought was, what a cheap casket this was.
Well, and so they strap it in on aircraft left. So aircraft right and aircraft left is as you're standing in the airplane looking at the front of the aircraft. So they strap it in there where they had taken the seats out. Mrs. Kennedy immediately takes her position there, and that's where she's going to end up staying for the rest of that day, only stepping up away for a few seconds. And Joe told me this story, that she was in the back of the airplane, and I know you were back there at one point. And of course, LBJ was going to insist on being sworn in on the airplane. He didn't have to be sworn in, right, Larry? Because he was already president.
Yeah, he didn't have to be sworn in. I mean, you're automatically, when the president dies, if you're the vice president, you're in. But as Paul mentioned, the chaos and the mayhem in the hospital, well, that chaos and mayhem was spreading across the nation. Because people didn't know what was going on. I mean, you got to remember, we were in contentious relationship with Russia at the time. People didn't know if we were being attacked, if this was part of a bigger plan. And so, LBJ wanted to be sworn in right then and there, which I think was a great decision.
Yeah.
It showed a great leadership that, we're gonna have that continuity of leadership immediately.
Yeah,
and we're not gonna wait.
He really did that for that purpose. But even more amazingly, standing next to him in a position of honor was our First Lady, our former First Lady, because she knew how important it was that the nation saw her standing there with the soon-to-be then president-elect. Even in her most sorrow moment, she knew how important it was that she stood there. And there's, of course, that famous photograph of President Johnson being sworn in with Lady Bird on his side, Mrs. Kennedy on his left, being sworn in by the retired judge that he actually appointed. And also in the doorway of that photo is just a silhouette and 2 eyes. Just a little bit of your eyes,
Yeah.
watching history unfold with Mrs. Kennedy in that same Chanel suit that we saw earlier in the day with her blood stain, her husband's blood on it. And that must have been just, really, you must be still beside yourself.
Well, as soon as I got on board Air Force One, I went to the front of the plane. I sat down, I broke down completely. I just sat there and I cried and I cried and I cried, and I didn't care what anybody thought. I just could not stop crying. Roy Kellerman shook me by the shoulder and he said, "Come on, Paul, you got to witness history." And I told him that I've already seen enough history, I don't have to see anything else. And he said, convinced me. He said, this is very important, come on. And he escorted me back to the bulkhead. I witnessed the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson, and I went back to my seat, resumed my cry, and I don't remember anything else.
So Joe tells the story that Joe is up in the front and they're getting ready to set up. He goes out, gets the judge, brings her on board, and LBJ says, "Where's Mrs. Kennedy?" And Joe says, Mr. President-elect, she's in the back of the aircraft with the president. Or he said, the First Lady's in the back of the aircraft with the president. And LBJ, according to Joe, says, Chief, this is the First Lady. Please tell Mrs. Kennedy I'd like to have her up here. So he goes to the back of the aircraft where Mrs. Kennedy is there with her husband, and he says, Mrs. Kennedy, President-elect Johnson would like you to come up to witness the swearing in. He said, the chief said that she looked at the casket, she looked up, and she got up and she walked up and took her place. So that's the poise that we talked about. Jamie, you want to add something really quick?
Yes, certainly. When you're in grief, you're also in anger and in defiance, and you want to strike out and get back at somebody. And that trip on Air Force One, a number of people were in agony trying to figure out how to approach Jackie and suggest as politely as possible that she change her clothes, and she would not. 1, 2, 3, 4 people tried, and after they heard the fourth or fifth no, they couldn't do it, and that was to show the world that she was defiant, and
She's
didn't
quoted
like what had
saying,
gone on.
I want them to see what they did.
Yes, yes.
I know there's a lot of questions. Paul's story would then come on to Washington, D.C., where they would take the president off the airplane, and he would go on to Bethesda Naval Hospital for a series of autopsies, and then eventually you would be at the funeral where there's an amazing picture of them walking behind the casket, the First Lady and our Robert Kennedy, his brother. Jamie is on one side. If you look at the photo, he's on the far left of that picture. He's going to hold it up now. But on the far right of that picture, right behind, is a young Paul Landis in the same picture. So again,
Teddy's hiding him.
Where else but the Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival are you going to hear and see this? So I know that you have questions. This, so again, that's the funeral which ended at Arlington. So I'm going to come to you with your questions. Please stand up and speak really loud, and we're going to do this quickly.
Bill Greer, the driver of the Lincoln, was a family friend, and I didn't know if his story and perspective has been lost to the ages or not. Any comments or thoughts?
Bill Greer.
Can you repeat the
The
question?
driver, Bill Greer.
I did not.
Did Bill ever talk about the story? He was the driver of the car.
Sam Kinney.
hear the question either.
Oh, okay. So he asked about Bill Greer. He said it was a family friend, and he was the driver of the president's car. Did Bill ever tell any stories or talk afterwards?
None of the agents talked to each other or talked about the assassination. I mean, I knew Sam Kinney. I kind of joked with him when we first arrived at Love Field. I can't really comment on anything that he said.
Okay. Anybody else?
I'm curious why
Which was his goal?
that was such a significant car. How come they continue to use it?
Yes.
Up in the Henry Ford
Yeah, so
Museum. We're going there this year, and I was shocked that the JFK car.
Yeah, so let's talk about that real quick, because that car actually was used in the next administration, and it was used all the way up until the Nixon administration. And as we do with the government, you know, the government's cheap. So they stripped the car down. It took it to Arlington to a specialist. The car was then stripped down all the way down to the bare metal. All the components of the car were taken out and stored. But it was used until President Nixon, as well as the airplane. The airplane was actually used until Bill Clinton's administration, not as Air Force One, but as a backup of one of the airplanes. Mary Eisenhower tells an amazing story, which I didn't know the other day, and I know she probably shared this with you. But that airplane, the plane that brought the president to Dallas that day, as well as brought him home to Washington, was the same airplane that was allowed to be used for her grandmother's funeral. In fact, the same place that the casket was placed was the same place that President Kennedy's casket was placed. And when she went on board that airplane at the museum, which is at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, she went on and she looked, and then she said, "Is this the plane that President Carter used?" And they said yes, and then she knew that that was the plane that was used for her grandmother, Mamie Eisenhower's funeral, in the exact location as the president. Did she share that with you when you met her?
No.
No. Okay. It's again
News
amazing
to me.
Yeah. Okay. What else? Yes.
I thought I had a controversial question. It's not. Okay, so this is for Paul. My question is, Grassy Knoll or Texas School Book Depository, where did the shots come from?
All right, you're going to have to repeat.
Question is, where did the shots come from? But if you look at the picture, he's looking back. So the question was, where do you think the shots came from?
Well, from behind over my right shoulder, and I'm looking up. I can't see anything. There is a tree that was kind of blocking our view of the school book depository. But I know that first shot. In my mind, my memory, everything, that shot came from behind and over my right shoulder. And if I'd look, the elevation would, if I think about it enough, the elevation was somewhere up the upper floors of the school book.
Just keeping in mind, Dealey Plaza is a plaza. It's an area those of us that have been there know. When you hear a shot, you hear noises, they bounce. They bounce. So a lot of that can have something to do with, 1, 2, 3, 5 bullets, 5 shots. Andrew, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, no, I just asked a question of Paul. Have you been back to that spot since?
I've been back like 3 times. I swore I'd never go back to Dallas after that day, but in 1984, I went back. We had a conference of former Secret Service agents, and I went back. I said it was time for me to go and put my mind at ease. I went down. I walked through the plaza, everything. I told everybody it helped, but it didn't.
Okay, that was my follow-up.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
The day before Dallas, the official motorcade route was changed. Do we ever know whoever changed that route?
The question was, the day before the motorcade route was supposedly changed? Was the motorcade route changed the day before?
I really don't know. I did read that in my briefing. I was not told anything really about the motorcade route. All I was given was my assignments and where I was supposed to be.
Okay.
So I just knew what the route was going to be that morning.
So you mentioned a second bullet that was under Mrs. Kennedy that was full and intact. Did you leave that in the car and just take the bullet that was the shell?
The bullet the bullet. Did you find 2 bullets or 1 bullet?
Was it 1 or 2?
See, with my hearing loss, I didn't understand the question.
1 bullet or 2 bullets did you find?
In the car.
In the car. How many bullets? Just the 1 bullet or 2 bullets?
One intact bullet on the back seat.
And did you leave that one?
No, that's the one he put in his pocket.
Oh, that's the one you put in your pocket.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
What was the crowd's reaction to the gunshots?
Well, the first shot, I just recall a few people scattering on the ground and running. There wasn't really time for me to check out the crowd. That wasn't where my focus was at that point.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you were talking earlier about the 50th anniversary of the assassination, and I was telling Paul the other night, I made it a point to be down there on that 50th anniversary of that because I had remembered it so vividly from when I was in the 4th grade. But one of the things about that, at what they did down there, and it was raining, it was cold on that anniversary, and they had a minute of silence, and they had all the downtown church bells tolling. And, people were crying, grown people, all of us were down there, people were crying just like they were 50 years ago, but it was really an emotional thing. And then got to go up into the book depository and be up in there where, right on the day of history. It was amazing experience. So just wanted to talk about that.
Okay, we're going to do 2 more questions. This is one.
Paul, do you have any recollection of the tension that existed between the Secret Service and the coroner and the medical professionals on possessing the president's body?
So Paul, we talked about that contention between the Secret Service agents and the coroner and the Dallas police. Did you witness a little bit of that? I think you mentioned that you kind of was just in a daze.
Well, I came in on the tail end of that. I thought, my first reaction was thinking, well, when they took the president's body and the trauma room, that this was going to be an autopsy taking place at that point, and I didn't think anything other. I knew that there was confusion, but not really what that was over.
Okay, last question.
You were talking about when you were 3 years old, and maybe some people are like, how could you remember that? But that was my birthday. I was turning 8. And I remember thinking at school, well, shoot, now I'm not going to get my birthday cake tonight. But it immediately left my mind, and as a child, you knew this was the worst thing in the world.
Yes.
Oh, yes. If I didn't give Miss Jan the last question, I would never hear the end of it.
Since we're at the end of this speech, I had the wonderful privilege of being with President and Mrs. Carter after the swearing in for his inauguration. And President Carter went over and announced to his mother, Miss Lillian, that they had decided they were going to walk in the parade. The head Secret Service that day got a severe lashing of Miss Lillian's tongue, calling him everything in the world for agreeing to let that happen. And of course, that had been a total secret until that moment. I can't say enough for the Secret Service men and women who have served this nation to protect our important people. Thank you, sir.
And we thank you, Paul Landis, Henry Bowden, Jamie Auchincloss, and Dr. Larry Cook, and Andrew, our First Ladies man. Thank you all very much. Now, as I told you, Paul does have a book. He has a book out. It's right here called The Final Witness. He will tell you how you can buy a copy and then how we can organize to get that signed. But we do have some amazing photographs taken that day that Paul will sign for you if you would so like to come out and say hello to him. Everyone is dismissed for lunch and for the rest of the festivities. Thank you very much for coming. Paul?
One last comment.
One last question. One last thing.
I'd like you all to read the book. You don't have to buy the book. I just read it. And it's simple. There's no conspiracy theory. It's simply what I heard, what I saw, and what I did. That's all it is. I have nothing else to
That's
throw
what we
out
like.
there.
We like that. All right. Thank you, everybody. Come outside and say hi to Paul.
Thank you.
All right. Let's get you right outside. Thank you, brother.
Nice job, gentlemen. Nice job.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, really quickly. Hurry.